And I think, as parents and caregivers, a lot of times we want to protect our kids from disappointment or the negative feelings that come with failure. But, kids really need the chance to kind of screw up and realize that it's not the end of the world. And, they can figure out another way around the problem and to make things better.
You're listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. In this series, we'll explore a variety of well-being topics with experts from the university community in physical, emotional, nutritional, and financial health. Join us, and together we'll discover how we can thrive at work, home, and beyond. Hello there, listener. I'm your host, Jacob Hester, and I'm delighted you're joining me for another episode of Becoming Wildly Resilient. That voice you heard at the beginning belongs to Dr. Alyssa Briggs. Alyssa is an associate professor of pediatrics and a licensed psychologist with UK Healthcare Adolescent Medicine. She's also a nationally and locally certified school psychologist. In this episode, we chat about resilience and mental health in children and teens, and you'll hear quite a few connections to past episodes. Some of what you'll learn includes what it means for children to be resilient, the protective factors and skills that enhance children's resilience, current mental health trends in school-age children, and how you can support resilience and mental health as a parent or caregiver. Alyssa also shares tips for coping as a parent or caregiver and touches on topics like growth mindset, the effects of social media use, and proper self-care for adolescents. October is National Work and Family Month, and UK HR Work Life is recognizing it with a variety of workshops throughout the month. Be sure to listen through the outro to hear a preview. Finally, before you get into our conversation, this is a quick reminder to hit the follow button in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss any future episodes. I appreciate everyone who continues to follow along each month and reaches out to provide any feedback or suggestions. And now, here's my conversation with Dr. Alyssa Briggs. Welcome, Alyssa. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about raising resilient children.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Can you first tell us a little bit about your professional life, what you do, what your areas of interest are and specialties, those types of things?
Yeah, so I am a licensed psychologist, and I am work in adolescent medicine, which is a division of pediatrics. I do a mix of things. I see patients for individual therapy. I test and diagnose different neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. I direct our outreach clinics in school. So we're in a couple of different counties providing mental health services in schools. And I also supervise and train upcoming psychologists and kind of coordinate our behavioral health services here in clinic. My specialty really is I guess it's a mix of things, but I tend to work most with kids with anxiety and depression, and then ADHD and autism spectrum disorder.
Sounds like a lot to keep you busy just professionally, but what about you as a person beyond work? What are some of the things that make you you?
I enjoy running. So I run about a marathon a year and usually like a couple half marathons. I have a hyperactive dog who runs with me. So we enjoy doing that together. I also am, our whole family, my husband, my kid, and I are water rats. We have 2 boats. So we spend most of our time on the lake, either sailing or we have a little speedboat we tootle around in. So I guess water and running and dog.
Your husband's actually a connection that we had that actually goes way back to my time prior to being at UK when I was down the road at Transylvania coaching cross country and track and field. And your husband actually was one of the faculty mentors with our team and used to come and run with us all the time. So we've had a secondary connection for quite a while. But I've got a section that I always like to start off with as well, where it's basically a random fact about each of us. So I have a deck of conversation starters here that I'll pull a random question out and then we'll both answer it so we don't know the answer ahead of time. So here we go. If you could choose to be brilliant in one subject, which would you choose?
I think I would probably choose math. because it's used so much across different fields. I kind of topped out at calculus. That was the end of it for me.
Yeah, that was enough to end math for me too. Oh, this was a tough one. I am leaning towards history, just out of like pure interest, I think, as far as a subject matter, I guess, is concerned. So I'm going to go with history. So, kind of jumping into our episode, I know a sizable portion of our population are actively raising younger loved ones, as am I, they may be planning to at some point in the future. But even if they're not, they may be, aunts, uncles, grandparents, or just interact with, teens and young adults and children in their work or their life. Because October is National Work and Family Month, I thought this would be a great time to narrow in our previous conversations on mental and emotional health and focus on the next generation, so children and teens. Obviously, this show is primarily about resilience, so I want to start there. I often hear that kids are resilient. How true is that statement?
Actually, I think it's pretty true. One of the main protective factors for kids, and one of the things that promotes resilience, is a close connection to an adult. It could be a caregiver, it could be a teacher or somebody at school, it could be somebody in the community. But to have at least one adult who they feel like knows them well and is a reliable person to go to for support. And about 9 out of 10 kids report having a person like that in their life. So, about 90% of kids have kind of one of the largest protective factors in place.
Yeah, I feel like it's always one of those things that they throw that term around, and I don't even think they necessarily think about it like a kid falls down, or like they're like, oh, we can go do this thing. Kids are resilient or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always kind of like, I've always thought about that phrase. And I'm like, oh, how true actually is that?
Yeah, and they're resilient if they have support. Kids aren't, some kids are resilient in and of themselves, but most kids, their resilience comes from having social support.
Yeah, because we talk about it a lot in kind of the adult world, particularly about it being like a skill too. It's not necessarily something like you have some sort of baseline resilience, but it is something that you can continue to hone and work on and find support and those types of things. So yeah, I think it was like sort of a misleading comment for me when I hear people say that, but it's good to know that a large majority of children in some form have the protective factors to have those skills or the resources and support to be more resilient.
Mm-hmm.
So what does resilience look like through those different stages as they're growing up from, toddler through like the teenage years?
For young kids, toddlers, really, what we're looking for is that, they have a sense of attachment to a caregiver or an adult where they feel like they can go out and explore the world and push boundaries a little bit, but then also have a safe place to run back to. So, a resilient kid is one who, may kind of, wander or run away from the parent and look back at them and maybe, check and make sure that they're paying attention and then continue exploring. Whereas, a kid who's maybe not as resilient, maybe kind of clingy right to their caregiver and not going out and exploring their environment. And then as kids grow up, their job is to kind of gradually separate from their parents, so in elementary school, they start to, develop their friend groups and start to rely, on peers for social support. And then that becomes, a major developmental task of teenage years is, to connect with your peer group and kind of dismiss your parents as, being the main ones involved in your life. So I think, the theme really is, feeling that you have a secure enough base that you can go out and explore and try out new things.
Yeah, I feel like that's tough to watch it because both of those is like the kids willing to kind of step away and separate themselves and explore. And like as a parent, I think you can kind of take that as like almost like personally, if you're not careful, they're like, oh, they don't need me or they don't want me around. Or something like that, when it is about a supportive relationship and they're comfortable enough to explore those rather than just being like teenage rebellion necessarily.
Right.
So part of resilience too is really that kind of ability to cope and manage and adapt to any of the sort of challenges and things that we face. So those obviously look a lot different for children as well. So what are some of the like most common mental, emotional, or social challenges that young people experience throughout their developmental years?
One, I think, is failure and being able to cope with that, or things not going just right, and being able to try again and problem solve. And I think, as parents and caregivers, a lot of times we want to protect our kids from like, disappointment or the negative feelings that come with failure. But, kids really need the chance to kind of screw up and realize that it's not the end of the world. And, they can figure out another way around the problem and to make things better. And I guess, one thing I come back to a lot, when I was in high school, we didn't have like infinite campus or things like that, right? Where parents could kind of monitor your assignments and your grades. You kind of got your report card 4 times a year. And if your grades were bad, you kind of tried to beat your parents home to the mailbox, right, to kind of hide it. And I think, now with technology, parents have the ability to log on and monitor their kids' progress, and that's useful to an extent. And I think, sometimes we get a little too caught up in the minutia of, this one assignment is a 0, or you didn't do great on this test. And, kids really need a chance to some degree to kind of figure out some of that stuff on their own and learn how to cope and regroup from that.
Yeah, my son's in childcare right now, and they have an app where I can like track not his like every movement throughout the day, but like when they change a diaper, when he's like eating, when he's sleeping. Like we got one yesterday about like a developmental milestone, and it's like I catch myself, I have to like try not to get on there and just like follow his day, because I think it is kind of a trap to get stuck in as a parent.
Yeah.
Again, sort of like not wanting to be a helicopter parent, but just being like caring enough to really want to be there as well, and realize that like they also need a little bit of that freedom and independence as well, which I think is something we'll kind of talk about here in a bit. But how do those challenges sort of shape their life later on potentially?
I think, in life, we face a series of challenges, and as we grow older, those challenges tend to have higher stakes and they tend to be a little bigger. And I think a lot of development is about practice. So, it's important to have practice facing challenges and figuring out how to work through it. And it's not to say that, a kid has to do it all by themselves, but to kind of have an adult coach them in problem solving rather than fixing things for them or telling them, exactly what they should do. Because eventually, right, the kind of going back to the school thing, right, it's much better to fail a middle school class than it is a college class.
Mm-hmm.
And in middle school, you're still there to kind of support your kid in regrouping. Whereas if they don't have any experience with that, they go off to college, they fail an exam, and then, they're kind of out on their own. So I guess just kind of guided practice, I guess, is what I would say is important. So guided practice with facing life's challenges, like not fixing things, but, kind of helping support and navigate.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a difference too between the sort of like regular day-to-day challenges that you would experience, or sort of the normal like developmental challenges that you may experience throughout the younger years, as opposed to like things like ACEs, which I think came up in the previous conversation as well, those adverse childhood experiences and how those like really can impact your health and well-being much further down the line than, missing an assignment or something like that.
Absolutely.
It's very much a short-term problem.
Right.
So you mentioned protective factors already. What are some of the essential skills or protective factors that really enhance resilience for this age group?
Connectedness is a huge one, right? So connectedness to adults and peers. And then there are some, internal protective factors too. And those are things that can be taught, or some, things kids come by naturally. But, things like being able to tolerate frustration, being able to regulate emotions, being able to regulate behavior, and, just being able to cope with stress. And a lot of schools are starting to incorporate, social emotional learning in the classroom. So I know in my kids' school, they get it's kind of weaved throughout the day. And then they also get specific instruction in like behavior regulation skills and emotion regulation skills and things like that. And they get some coaching on that as well throughout the day. And I think, that's just part of becoming an entire person. Some people naturally have the temperament where those things come automatically to them, but a lot of kids don't, and they do need instruction in how to build those muscles.
Yeah, it's amazing how that's changed over the years. Like I'm the same way. I don't remember having lessons on those types of things growing up. Certainly could have used them because
Right? Would have
they're
been
lessons
very
I had to
helpful.
learn in my 20s probably. And for some of them, I'm still learning in my 30s. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about like how that's been embedded into the school system and stuff like that now too. And so that actually kind of brings up a point around like growth mindset. I think we had a previous episode that was fully devoted to growth mindset, but we've talked about it a couple different times on the show, and how that like framework is really has its roots in school age children. So in the eyes of resilience, what is a growth mindset look like for children?
Yeah. Actually, I have there's a children's book I love called I Can't Do That, comma, Yet. And it's a story, about how a kid goes through and tries different things and realizes they can't do it yet. And it's been a while since I read it with my kid. But I think, I remember adults telling me when I was a kid never to say I can't. But then there was never any guidance on what else to say. Right. And so I think the message is to say I can't yet. Like, this is something that I can keep working on. This is something like I can keep pushing for rather than just to give up. So I think that's the main idea, right? With a growth mindset is that we can always improve and we don't have to automatically know how to do things right away.
Yeah. Particularly as they develop too, and they kind of have a little more cognitive awareness, you can start framing or reframing challenges as opportunities, particularly those small everyday challenges, as things that they can learn from as well. So if it is, say, a failed assignment or something like that, not letting them internalize that as like, oh, I'm dumb, I'm never going to learn how to do this. And it's really about like, hey, you didn't do well on this test, sure, but what can you learn from this test? How can you make this better? How can you study a little better? How can you be more efficient? How can you learn a little bit better? What steps can you take so that this doesn't happen again or is less likely to happen again? And so I think the like skill set for me, I guess that's why it's kind of universal in the way that it's applied, but it doesn't sound a whole lot different from like dealing with maybe a middle schooler than it is to deal with it as like a 40 or 50-year-old adult.
And I think the way you phrase your questions about that is really important. Like, how can you do this better? Or how could you study different? Versus, I think sometimes there's a temptation to say, well, you should have done this, or you should have done that, or next time you need to do blah, 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 right? And then you're directing. And really what you want to be doing is coaching and asking questions that'll, support the kid in figuring out what they might want to try differently.
Yeah, I like how you put that with like coaching rather than directing. And that's a concept we've talked about with like being a manager or a leader even, and like how you deal with your employees. So it's really interesting to see the parallels between like how maybe like a caregiver deals with a young child versus like how a leader may deal with an employee. That's a really simplistic way to put that, and it puts a weird, strange power dynamic in the visual. But as far as like the skill set, they're kind of similar to me based on the way that I hear it. But one of those protective factors that you mentioned as well was like the connectedness. So we obviously know that social connection is really important to your overall well-being. So how do we teach kids to like develop empathy and kindness and healthy relationships with others in a way that's not forcing it and hopefully sticks around into their adult years?
I think play in childhood is incredibly important. And so having opportunities to be in person with other kids in an unstructured way, engaging in play, is really essential to their development and in figuring out how to navigate some of those things. And, a lot of kids, they explore their world and try and understand things through play. And you see that in other animals too, like other animals try, to figure out how to interact with each other through play. So I think, taking time to take kids to a playground, where they're going to be able to interact with other peers or have them in activities where they will have, some unstructured time to play, with some adult support and monitoring, is important. I think, I would love to have my kid do everything and do all the activities, because I just get enthusiastic about stuff. But, my husband is good in reining me back and saying, we're only going to have things scheduled, after school on 2 days right now. Our kid is 8, right? Because they need time to come home and just have unstructured time to play. And that's how kids figure stuff out.
Yeah, I think that's a more common phenomenon too. Like I remember doing things as a kid and like being involved in different stuff, but I don't remember it being every day. I even remember like my like actual memories are much more of me like having the freedom to play and the things that I did as a
Mm-hmm.
kid and just like hopping on a skateboard or a bike or something and just going around our neighborhood with like kind of aimlessly with no real direction or anything planned, rather than planning out every single moment of the day too. And it's interesting that play is one of those things too, because that we did an entire episode on that as well, from an adult perspective and the
Mm-hmm.
importance of play as an adult. So we don't lose that as we get older. I think we just sort of societally lose it, but the need for that doesn't go away or shouldn't be going away when we age. Something else you talked about, were like being able to tolerate frustrations and regulating emotions and behavior. So, are there any like specific coping or self-regulation strategies or tools or mindsets that you could teach to children to help promote resilience?
Yeah. So, we've experimented, with a variety of different things, actually, while I have as a professional and then in our own house. I will say coping with frustration is not something me or my child are incredibly skilled at naturally.
Same.
It's something, that we've had to kind of have some trial and error with and work out. But what we have found is that really, time, just time, right, is a great thing, and realizing that not everything has to be fixed right then and there.
Hmm.
So one thing, that my kid does at school and at home is, if they're feeling overwhelmed, and it's taken some coaching to help them realize when they are getting signs that they're overwhelmed. But right when they're feeling that way, they have a safe, comfortable space they can go to kind of relax and regroup for 5 minutes. And that space includes some different sensory things in which they can engage. So like some stuffed animals, some fidgets, some scented putty, some kinetic sand. And, when you engage your senses, when you're feeling escalated, it kind of interrupts that stress loop in the brain. So that's what we've kind of figured out. And on the adult end, when I'm really aggravated with my kid, which happens, I'm a parent too, I set a timer on my watch, and I will not let myself say or do anything until that timer goes off, because I know anything that comes out of my mouth is not going to be helpful within that 5 minutes. So I think, what we've kind of learned is just time, right? Our brains cannot sustain that intense level of frustration for very long.
Yeah, that's actually another concept that we've kind of talked about as well, is really that stimulus and response and creating as much space as you can create between those two things, so that the response doesn't come out the way that you didn't want it to come out. I think something else that I've noticed now as a parent, particularly in having a house full of kids' books, are the number of kids' books that start to deal with emotional regulation, and just understanding and particularly naming emotions, and what those feel like and look like and present, as an individual, and what you may see with somebody else. So it's a little bit of that empathy piece, but also like understanding in your own self, like I'm feeling frustrated, then
Mm-hmm.
this is what frustration looks like. And they're using color and they're using the pictures to kind of help them understand that. That's another one of those things that I don't feel like I got as a kid necessarily, because I don't think that was really that probably wasn't really like a topical kind of thing, back in the mid 90s or whatever. It may have been, but I don't know terribly many people around my age that we're like exposed to those types of concepts. So now we're like trying to learn those and like really dig in, because that's actually hard work to
Mm-hmm.
understand, like I'm having this reaction, but really digging a little bit deeper and like going from feelings, like what I'm feeling right now, to what is actually kind of this need that's maybe being unmet, and what that looks like, and really putting the appropriate words to that as well. So I think that to me is a skill that I think is starting to be embedded in, obviously, in schooling and in the types of books and stuff that you read too to your kids.
Yeah, and there are some great books out there on that for sure. I think the other thing too is that sometimes kids need permission to feel bad. Um, I think culturally sometimes we tend to be a little bit afraid of like sadness or anger or frustration. And we need permission to feel all of those emotions, just to feel them in a way that doesn't infringe upon the rights of others, right? So, I think the other thing that taking time does is it kind of gives permission to kind of sit and be upset for a little bit. And that's a fine way to be.
Yeah, it takes me back to like the way that Susan David talks about it, and like that feelings and emotions they're not directives necessarily. They are just sort of data points. So conveying that to a younger individual may be a little more challenging because they're not exposed to the word, data necessarily,
Yeah.
as if they're like, 5 years old. But yeah, it's really, to me, it's kind of about that concept. So I think I kind of alluded to this already as well, but like when that road starts to get a little bumpy, I feel like we have this instinct as like a parent or caregiver to sort of jump in immediately, intervene. And I imagined, although well intentioned, that actually could potentially have some, detrimental, or at least hamper the like the development of those essential skills for resilience. So how do parents or caregivers balance this instinct with that like independence that's needed to explore and learn?
Yeah, that's really hard. And, my automatic instinct is to jump in and intervene. I can definitely cite many times where my husband has told me to step back and let our kid figure it out. Um, and it's hard to do because you don't want to see your kid struggle, and you
Hmm.
don't want to see them, in pain. But I guess that some examples I can think of is, when my kid has had struggles in the classroom, right? Instead of jumping in and emailing the teacher and trying to sort it out with the teacher, kind of coaching my kid through, okay, how would you go about talking to your teacher about this? What would you say? And when would you do that during the day? And kind of, I think kids, they need the chance to handle it on their own, right? And there are times that, sometimes that may go well. And then as an adult, right, if your kid has the chance to kind of give it a try and it doesn't go well, then you can kind of jump in and provide more support. But again, I think it comes back to kind of being able to coach them through trying to figure it out on their own. And I hear from some kids as well that, that they feel sometimes that their parents are so on top of it that they don't have the chance to show that they can do it independently.
Mm.
Like they don't even know if they can do it independently because they've never been given the chance to try. And so I think, being given the chance to prove that you can do it is an important part of building self-efficacy, which is important for resilience.
Yeah, as I'm thinking about this and kind of processing too, it feels like that. I mean, I mentioned the stimulus and response and creating that space in between too. I think this might be an opportunity where that comes into play as well, where you can, in that space, you take a moment to, like, as quickly as you can in some scenarios, but like, is this like a physical danger where I really need to intervene at the moment? Or is this something that is one of those instances where this is not like a life or death kind of situation? This is not something that's going to affect them in the long run. This is a really good opportunity for them to learn. Let me step back, and my response is to step back and let them figure it out and see what happens, and sort of guide them where I might need to. So I think that's another good use of that, like creating space prior to that response. But basically just analyzing the situation in real time and like, oh, maybe I need to step in, maybe I don't, and trying to figure out where that sort of line is. But I guess that's the real challenge, is where does that line get drawn?
Yeah.
In my last conversation too, I spoke with one of HR's mental health therapists about anxiety and depression in adults. So I know this is an area obviously you work in with children. So what are some of the mental health trends that you're seeing in children and teens?
The data we have from the schools we go into, we screen all of the students in the schools, and we have a couple questions about anxiety and depression, and about 1/3 report anxiety and depression. And so to me, that reflects that it's a common experience, and not one that can be solved with individual therapy. So I think, we have to think strategically about how do we infuse some of this social emotional support throughout, the general curriculum. How do we identify kids, that we can kind of connect to resources that may not need that individualized support, so that we can really identify and focus on the kids who really are struggling and need that individual support. So, I guess the trend really is that it's unfortunately really quite common. And that kind of bears out in the national data as well. I think it really always has been quite common. I mean, I think the rate, there's definitely been an increase, but I think it's pretty consistently been around 1 in 5 kids who are struggling. And I just think we're finally talking about it and paying attention to it. Which is part of it. I think, maybe some kids feel more comfortable mentioning it, but I think the pandemic really presented a challenge in that, everyone experienced a massive stressor all at once. So if we talk about ACEs, everyone went through it all at once. So everybody's capacity to cope and help each other cope was challenged. And then a huge protective factor was taken away from everyone at the same time, which was their connection to others. And I think, we're still kind of dealing with a lot of the aftermath of that, there's a bit of work that's still ongoing in terms of building back up peer groups, building back up social networks, building back up kind of those in-person collegial relationships that we used to have before the pandemic hit. And so I think, that's a challenge we're working through now that I think is, maybe contributing to some of the distress we're seeing.
Yeah, I think an interesting point that you made was that it's not necessarily going to be solved with individual therapy, because I think that that's the sort of, vision that people get when you start talking about mental health, and like, oh, you go to a therapist and deal with it, and that's your private matter, and that's it, and it's fine, and everything is good and dandy, and we move forward. But when it's, 1 in 3, the strain on dealing with that on the healthcare system and like finding a therapist, we see that nationally and how difficult that is. And it probably gets even more difficult when you start getting into specialties like children potentially. But yeah, just that recognition of knowing how common it actually is, and that the solutions, while individual therapy is a piece of that, it's collectively what we do in our systems as well. So what do we do in the school system? What do we do in the workplace? All those types of things, and how we move forward. And I think that's the type of conversation that gives me the most hope to moving forward, and hopefully maybe the rates don't go down. I don't know, but at least our ability to cope with them both individually and collectively seems hopefully to get better over time, when we start focusing on those types of things and solutions that can help us across multiple like strata, basically. So you mentioned kind of the effect of the pandemic as well. Do you feel like that's starting to ease a little bit with the pandemic easing, or do you feel like this is something we're going to be dealing with for much, much longer, even as the pandemic sort of kind of fades a little more to the background?
I think it's easing a little bit. But, what we know is that when people are, struggle to recover from trauma, that the impact of adverse experiences can last some time. And there's still healing that's ongoing. And I think the pandemic changed the way we function because it lasted so long, and it introduced some things that just aren't going away. And some for better, some for worse. So for example, where, we used to get together in person and enjoy our regular staff meetings over pizza, we're now on Zoom with like our little black squares while we're eating by ourselves at home. And so, that, while the pandemic is gone and maybe we'd all be safe being together, we've kind of got, well, I guess that's not necessarily true in the healthcare setting. I mean, we're still having to be careful of masks, but, there still are ways in which our world has changed that I think is kind of chipping away at that connectedness with each other that we need in order to be resilient. So maybe Zoom meetings are fine, but then we need to think of other ways where we can build connection with each other, since we've lost that piece of it. And I think for kids too, I think sometimes we feel like our kids are connecting with their peers when they're interacting by text or over social media or over FaceTime. But that connection isn't nearly as meaningful as just unstructured time in person. And, we are still humans. We do still need that.
Yeah, the social media piece and like texting and all that, I wish I could remember it off the top of my head right now, but I saw like a clip the other day about how like realistically when we're like texting and we're using social media and all that, we're not having a real conversation in real time anymore. It's like I can send you a text and you can respond immediately maybe, or you could wait 45 minutes, an hour, or the next day and respond back to me. And yeah, we're going back and forth, but like it's not the same as us right now going back and forth, even though you and I are in separate locations right now. At least we still have a little bit of that like face-to-face immediate reaction kind of conversation. But the more that we kind of get into social media and texting and that sort of thing, there are kind of unintended consequences, I think, that like, oh yeah, we're more connected than we ever were. But in reality, we're not actually having those conversations anymore. And so I think when we start coming back together too, it makes it even more apparent that like, oh, it's really challenging to have a conversation or something that we took for granted 2.5 years ago. That now we're like, oh, I have to relearn how to have a conversation with somebody in person, because that's way different than it is for me to have a conversation on Zoom or to send them text messages or communicate through GIFs or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I think brings up a good point too about like social media. How does that impact the mental health of young people, particularly those who are kind of in the age range to be using it?
Well, I think, what we see with social media is that it has a polarizing impact. So when humans have a natural bias to look for information that reinforce what we already believe. So, and that kind of has led to some of the polarization we see in social media in our culture. And also what happens if you're a kid who has really good self-esteem and, you feel good about your peer group and, you pretty much believe, you don't have an inflated ego, but you pretty much believe that you're pretty awesome, right? And when you get on social media and interact, you're going to find stuff that kind of reinforces that belief about yourself and that your world, and so it can be fine. It can even be helpful, I guess. But then, if you're a kid who's depressed or feeling self-conscious or thinking about yourself negatively in a certain way, you get on social media and you start looking and, seeing other kids with other groups and, compare yourself to them in a negative way. And that can fuel anxiety and depression. And actually, one thing that's not talked about as much, but what happened over the pandemic was a huge escalation in eating disorders. And, I think, I wonder if some of that was, more time on the screen, being able to kind of engage in some of the harmful imagery that's out there regarding our ideals about our bodies, combined with, kind of less socialization around eating. I'm not sure exactly, but that, is another phenomenon that's come out of that pandemic that, I do think social media likely does play a role in that as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and something I had not really considered or thought about is like a byproduct and a connection to mental health that social media would potentially have, especially throughout the pandemic as well, because you heard about people talking about like the COVID-15 or whatever, kind of making light of like the freshman 15 or something like that. But it sounds like that might have actually been more detrimental and less light than people were making of that.
Yeah.
So how do mental health conditions like anxiety or depression manifest in children? Are there like telltale signs?
They manifest differently in kids than they do in adults, in that, kids don't have a lot of times the language or understanding about what's going on in their mind, or in their body, that adults do. And so you'll see behavior as communication. So kids who are anxious or depressed may have explosive tantrums. If they have little hope, they may engage in high risk taking behavior with their peers. So I think sometimes we need to pay closer attention to the kids who drive us crazy. All kids want to do well if they can, is what the psychologist, Ross Green says. There aren't kids out there who really want to be bad kids. And I think sometimes when kids engage in behavior that drives us nuts, they get a bad rap. But the vast majority of the time, it's anxiety or depression or some other mood-based concern fueling that behavior. So I think it's, that's important to take a closer look at. And then, the typical things also are that we see with anxiety and depression: avoidance of, school, avoidance of leaving the house, isolation in the room, sleeping too much, sleeping not enough, eating too much, eating not enough, those kinds of things. And I think sometimes, we're in tune to that, but we're not in tune to what kids' behavior really means.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference between dealing with it as an adult and dealing with children, and recognizing that, because you mentioned it, like they don't really have the words or skills, or maybe they're not even old enough to be at that point, to be able to express those things, but they could still be experiencing those. And I think about like the teenage years too, where they're just flush with hormones, and they don't really know how to deal with that either. And that's at a chemical level. So how do we, I guess, recognize when those emotions or behaviors are sort of moving beyond those like developmentally appropriate or developmentally expected levels, and then kind of when it might be time to seek some professional help?
Yeah. I love the formula of, I've noticed that, you describe whatever you're noticing to the kid plus what's up, right? So what's going on? Like I've observed this. What's going on? Let's talk about this. And you can have that kind of conversation, with kids at really any age that they're, able to communicate. You can have that kind of conversation with a 3-year-old. You can have that conversation with a 17-year-old. I've noticed this happened. What's going on? What does that mean? And I think that's, an important place to start, because that shows the kid that you're paying attention, and it gives them the opportunity to kind of think through what's going on and then let you know. And then there was something else to your question I lost track of. Sorry.
Oh, just like when, kind of recognizing when it might actually be time to seek professional help.
All kids have meltdowns here and there. That's part of normal development. So do adults. We all have meltdowns here and there. I think when we seek professional help is when it's getting in the way of daily functioning, right? We can't get out the door to go to school. Yeah, we can't get it together to go to bed. Or when it's happening, frequently. So there's, I guess, the degree to which it's disruptive, right? And then there's how often it's happening. So if it's happening really frequently, and then how intense is it, right? So all kids have tantrums. Not all kids chuck a chair across a classroom, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the level or degree of things that are happening?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's an important recognition, basically, and kind of helping deal with that, because it's hard enough to deal with it with yourself and like understand what are these feelings really telling me, what's sort of that underlying need. But when you're doing it with someone else who also doesn't have that language, there's additional barriers that get put up there. So there's not like, there shouldn't be like that shame really in seeking help and how to understand that. But at that basic level at the beginning of your response, I really liked that I've noticed that what's going on, because that's really mm-hmm. like, it comes from a really curious place and really a non-judgmental type of place, and just saying, yeah. Hey, I've noticed this. What's happening? You tell me, rather than like, you're throwing chairs across the room. What is wrong with you?
Right.
Kind of thing, which I think is that kind of maybe like old schoolish mentality of like, what's wrong with you? Snap out of it, get it together, like pull yourself together. And it's like, well, that's not really helpful. Like there's something that's causing that, chair being thrown across the room besides them just not being able to handle it. There's something else potentially behind that. So if you come at it with that curious, non-judgmental attitude, then I think you're more likely to get to the root of that much quicker and a much kind of more psychologically safe space too.
Yeah. And not being judged is of the utmost importance to adolescents in particular. So when working with a teen or an adolescent, figuring out how to communicate in a way that's free of judgment is critical.
Yeah. And I think it's an opportunity to really, model things like empathy and compassion too.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of a back end way of teaching them those types of skills that they can take into adulthood, because they're going to remember those things. They're going to practice the things that they're seeing you do as well. And I have to remind myself of that constantly. Like I can't throw a tantrum because he's going to see that that's a tantrum's a normal thing to do when it may not be. So that's still something that I have to like be cognizant of, and how I react to certain things as well. And practice what I preach to as a parent and as a human being. So let's finish by talking a little more broadly about supporting well-being at home, and particularly mental well-being and mental health. So what do you wish parents and caregivers would do more of, or maybe not do more of, when it comes to the well-being of young people?
I think myself included, and I will throw myself under the bus here, and that is to stay off of your phone. So I've been told by my kid, you're always on your phone texting. Like, we should take that as a clue that we need to have times, right, where we set down our phone, we disengage from our email, we disengage from our text, and, pay attention. So that's something, that I actively work on, right, is to take off the Apple Watch and take off the phone and just be, or put it on do not disturb, right, and be present in the moment, so that you can have an authentic, ongoing interaction. Because again, I think if we think about what the major protective factors are, it's connectedness. And our phones seem like they would help us connect more to others, but in a lot of ways, they're really disruptive to that process.
Yeah, because you feel like you're connecting with someone else in that moment, potentially, if that's what you're doing, if you're not, just playing a video game or something. But there's other people potentially in the room who you also could be connecting with, and we know the power of being there together, and how much stronger that bond is in those types of scenarios too. So it's really, it kind of is a shift too in how you have to think about like the perspective of those types of things.
Yeah.
Self-care is another topic that comes up quite a bit on the show. And we've talked quite a bit too about how like there's this misleading advice and products that are being sold as self-care to adults. I feel like that hasn't quite reached the like younger generation yet, in the same way that they're sold like, water guns and, dolls or what have you, whatever the hot toy of the day is, that show up, if you're even watching commercials anymore. But what are some ways that children and teens can practice self-care in a way that's beneficial and healthy?
I think one is learning how to validate themselves. So again, to recognize what they're feeling, and then also be able to give themselves some credit for what they're feeling makes sense. So I work with a lot of kids who are, like, I'm just really upset and I don't even know why. And then, we talk through it and we get down to it, and right, they're being excluded by their peer group. I'm like, of course you've been upset. This is awful, right? And that it's important, for you to give yourself some compassion about what you're going through. And so I think self-validation, self-compassion, I think are really critical self-care tools. We're really good at giving those things to other people, but not really good about giving those things to ourselves. And then I think the other thing is, learning how to set boundaries, around your time versus others. I think, peers really want to be there for each other, and sometimes they feel like they have to be on call for their friend, all throughout the night. And that's really not a healthy place to be either, right? So learning how to set boundaries around what you need for your own care versus what your peers may need.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound a whole lot different from what we have to do as adults. I think the advantage maybe that kids have is that they're not necessarily having to deconstruct old behaviors that were not helpful. They
Mm-hmm.
have a little bit more of a cleaner, fresher slate to work from than we do as adults. But the actual like skill and the focus of things like self-compassion and setting boundaries and just self-efficacy and those types of things are still sort of the baseline across all generations, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
So, what advice do you have specifically for parents and caregivers themselves? Because how do we really juggle all of this when inevitably we're going to struggle as human adults too?
Well, I come back to self-compassion, right? I think, we're all going to make mistakes, and I think the important thing is to focus on, what we can change, what we want to do better, and to give ourselves some credit or compassion for when we struggle. Um, I can sit and talk about, what I recommend for parents and people and kids, and I go home and I mess up, right? So
Hmm.
it happens. We're all human. I think I've even had my kids say, and you call yourself a psychologist,
Now it cuts deep, right?
right? So I mean, these things are hard to do, but I think the important thing is, and what resilience is, taking a moment, giving yourself some compassion, and then regrouping and thinking about how you want to tackle things in the future, is how you keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think the self compassion piece is an element of resilience that I don't think was previously included in what we traditionally saw as resilience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people potentially listening to all these episodes, like I have resilient in the title, and that's sort of the basis of the show. But the way that we talk about like emotions and how to cope and deal is sort of different intentionally in the way that we've sort of seen resilience in the past and how we like I don't know, I saw actually, and I'll link it in the show notes. There was an article about, I think it was from NPR, about like stopping complimenting people on how resilient they are, because of the way that actually could be interpreted or just reinforcing old norms that aren't necessarily helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, for those wanting to kind of dive a little deeper into your resilience or mental health in young people, what other resources do you recommend? Are there any, books or podcasts or anything like that?
There are, for younger kids, I love the book I Can't Do That Yet. There's also a book that describes emotions called In My Heart.
That's a good one.
It has, yeah, some of my favorite descriptions of emotions in it. Um, I love, for parents for themselves, I love the book Fierce Self-Compassion. Actually, I just read that this year for myself, and it made a huge impact on me. I think, the author kind of talks about giving yourself that self-compassion, but then also kind of connecting to your mama bear side when you need to stick up and stand up for things
Hmm.
for your kids. So I love that resource. Anything by Ross Green regarding parenting, I think is fantastic. And he has a website that has links to his own podcast and a bunch of resources. But yeah, I don't think you can go wrong with him. And then there's the classic How to Talk to Your Children So They Will Listen, and How to Listen So Your Children Will Talk, or something like that. I'm probably getting the words mixed up, but it's an oldie but goodie on basically, just how to talk and listen to your kids and support them throughout their development. And then Lisa Damore has some great books on raising girls and anxiety. And she has her own podcast where she always has really good little tidbits on some of the challenges we face when raising adolescents that I enjoy listening to.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a good extensive list. And I'll link all of these in the show notes as well. And don't worry about the book title if you did happen to butcher it, because I can clean that up in the show notes and
Okay.
make sure that they get the appropriate link. I've done that a couple of times where I've said something and I'm like, I don't think that's quite right. And then I go to pull the link later. I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely messed that one up, but I can correct it in the show notes. So you can always check it out there. I'll have all those things that you just mentioned so that folks can explore further if they want. But one of the kind of resource that we like to provide on here is the Wildly Resilient playlist. So we've got that going on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube Music. So each guest gets a chance to, contribute a song. So here's your chance. What song would you add that brings about a sense of resilience in your life?
Oh, song. Okay, so in terms of songs, I listen mostly to books. And Taylor Swift, because that's all my kid will listen to right now, too.
Taylor Swift has not made an appearance on the podcast yet, and I'm sure she's got a good one on there.
Yeah, oh, she does. I think we're memorizing the 1989 album right now. Is what we're doing. Really like "Shake It Off," to be honest.
That's a good
one.
one.
Were you there at Transy when the
I was. I am in that video. Off? Well, I say that. I'm not in the fraternity one. We recreated it as an athletics department, and I am in that one. And if I can find the video, I will go no shame, and I'll link that in there as well.
So let's do "Shake It Off" then.
Yeah, that was a really fun experience. So that works for me too. I like that one. That's one of my favorites. So I'll add that one onto the playlist. But we're at the last word now. What's the one thing you hope listeners take away from this conversation?
I think that our resilience as humans, as kids, and as adults lies in our connections with others. So thinking through how we can build that connection, and then also to work on giving ourselves some compassion for when things are hard.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate you so much for taking some time out of your day to come talk to me about raising resilient children and sharing all your knowledge.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode. I hope you're leaving this conversation with a better understanding of resilience and mental health in children and teens. I also hope you're taking away some strategies you can use to support the next generation and yourself as a parent or caregiver. As I mentioned in the intro, October is National Work and Family Month. Our wellbeing partners in UK HR Work Life are recognizing it with several events throughout the month. UK employees will find workshops on establishing priorities, maintaining healthy relationships at home or work, caregiving with self-compassion and loving kindness, and more. So check the link in the show notes to see all that's being offered and to register. UK Human Resources also offers year-round support for working parents and caregivers, including childcare resources, sitter referrals, and a working parents network. As mentioned in the previous episode, UK employees also receive 5 free and confidential appointments with our mental health therapist each fiscal year. Your spouse or dependents can take advantage of any of your 5 appointments, which are available in person, online, and by phone. You'll find that link in the show notes as well. And on that note, the show notes will have links to anything else we mentioned in the episode, including the books and podcasts recommended by Dr. Alyssa Briggs. As always, I'll include a link to the HR calendar where you can browse any upcoming work life and well-being events from University of Kentucky Human Resources. Until next time, take care of yourself and others, and stay well. Thanks for listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, a podcast series from University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. The UK HR Health and Wellness team, consisting of certified health coaches, fitness experts, registered dietitians, and wellness specialists, offer a wide range of online and in-person programming to University of Kentucky employees, retirees, and their spouses. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen and subscribe to future episodes wherever you find your podcasts. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by searching @UKY Wellness. There, you'll find links to episode show notes and more. You can also email healthandwellness@uky.edu with any questions or suggestions for future episode topics. To learn more about well-being benefits offered by University of Kentucky Human Resources, visit www.uky.edu/HR/wellbeing. Live well.